My name is Linnea Carter. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of woman people describe as easy to be around. Quiet, reliable, observant. I work behind the scenes in operations, the kind of role that keeps things running smoothly while credit flows elsewhere. If you met me at a family gathering, you might remember that I helped clear plates or that I listened more than I spoke. You probably wouldn't remember my opinions, and that was fine. Until it wasn't. People often mistake my calm for compliance. They think silence means agreement and patience means permission. I've learned that when you don't compete for attention, you're often written out of the story entirely. That invisibility can feel safe. It can also be dangerous. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about clever one-liners or dramatic confrontations. It's about observation, timing, and the quiet consequences of choices people didn't realize they were making. It's about family, how familiarity can blur moral lines, how money can turn affection into entitlement, and how quickly loyalty fractures when pressure is applied. At the center of it all was a sum that felt abstract until it didn't. $180,000. On paper, it was an inheritance distribution. In real life, it was a mirror. My relatives turned on each other. Over $180,000, and in the process, they revealed who they believed I was and what they assumed I would tolerate. I didn't argue. I didn't warn anyone. I watched quietly and learned everything. I learned who spoke first when there was something to gain. I learned who stayed silent when something felt wrong. I learned how quickly people rewrite history when it benefits them. And I learned something about myself, too, about the difference between being passive and being patient. What you're about to hear unfolds slowly. There are no villains twirling mustaches, no sudden windfalls, no illegal schemes. Just ordinary people making small, justifiable decisions that stack up into something irreversible. The emotional journey moves from familiarity to discomfort, from disappointment to clarity. And through it all, I remain calm. Not because I'm unaffected, but because calm is how I see clearly. I'm telling this story honestly, without embellishment, because I think many of us have been in rooms where we felt underestimated, where we sensed the shift before anyone named it, where we wondered whether staying quiet was wisdom or fear. If you've ever felt that tension, this story might feel uncomfortably familiar. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently, without judgment. Have you ever realized too late that people had already decided who you were without ever asking you? To my relatives, I was predictable. Not in a bad way, just in a useful way. I was the one who arrived on time and stayed until the end. The one who remembered birthdays without being reminded. The one who offered to organize documents, drive someone to the airport, or just handle it when a small responsibility floated awkwardly in the air and no one else reached for it. They trusted me with tasks. They did not trust me with decisions. In family conversations, my role was already written. I was the listener, the nodder, the neutral presence who made others feel reasonable just by being quiet. When opinions were shared, they came from louder voices, older siblings, more charismatic cousins, uncles who spoke with certainty even when they were guessing. When disagreements surfaced, I was the one people glanced at, not to ask what I thought, but to confirm that someone was still on their side. Linnea will understand. Linnea won't mind. Linnea doesn't care about that stuff. That last one was the most inaccurate and the most convenient. I cared. I noticed everything. I just didn't narrate my reactions out loud. Over time, people confused my restraint with absence. They assumed that because I didn't compete for space, I didn't occupy any. At family gatherings, I often ended up in the kitchen. Not because I was asked, but because it was expected. Plates would quietly slide toward me. Conversations would continue around me as if I were part of the furniture. If I stepped away, someone would eventually ask, "Where did Linnea go?" In the same tone you'd use when you misplaced your phone charger. Affectionate, casual, unthinking. No one ever asked me what I wanted, not directly, not seriously, and I trained them to believe that was fine. I told myself stories to make it easier. They're just louder than I am. This is how families work. It's not personal. But invisibility is rarely accidental. It's usually rehearsed by everyone involved. I learned early that expressing disagreement shifted the mood. When I once questioned a plan politely with caveats and soft language, the room went quiet in a way that felt corrective. Someone laughed it off. Another person reframed my words as overthinking. The conversation moved on without me. That was the last time I tried to insert myself without being invited. After that, I became efficient, observant, non-disruptive, and because I didn't push, they relaxed. People always do when they think you won't challenge them. They spoke more freely. They contradicted themselves. They forgot what they'd said last month or last year, assuming no one was tracking the difference. I was. What they never understood was that my silence wasn't emptiness, it was storage. I stored patterns. I stored tone changes. I stored who leaned forward when money was mentioned and who leaned back when responsibility appeared. But at that stage, I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't waiting for a moment. I was simply existing in the shape they'd assigned me because resisting it felt exhausting and unnecessary. There was comfort in being underestimated. It meant fewer expectations, fewer confrontations, less noise. And as long as things stayed fair, I told myself it didn't matter. The problem with roles is that they harden over time. What begins as convenience becomes assumption. What begins as kindness becomes entitlement. And eventually people stop seeing you as a person who chooses to give and start seeing you as a resource that simply exists. That's who I was to them, the steady one, the agreeable one, the one who wouldn't make things difficult. They didn't realize that my cooperation had conditions. Not written ones, not spoken ones, just quiet internal lines that, once crossed, would change how I moved forever. At the beginning of this story, those lines were still intact. No one had tested them yet. And if you'd asked my relatives how they saw me then, they would have smiled and said something like, "Oh, Linnea, she's easy. She's not really involved in all that." They believed that. I let them. The first moment wasn't dramatic enough to remember clearly at the time. That's how these things usually start. Not with an explosion, but with a hairline crack you only notice later, when the structure begins to fail. We were sitting around my aunt's dining table, the kind that was always slightly too big for the room. Papers were spread out between half-empty coffee cups. It was supposed to be a practical conversation, logistics, timelines, nothing emotional. At least, that's how it was framed. Someone mentioned the number casually, $180,000. Not as a lump sum, but as a total, an amount to be handled, sorted, distributed later. The words floated lightly, as if money that size were just another household chore. I didn't speak, I listened. Voices layered over each other, confident and unbothered. People talked about needs, plans, and assumptions. One cousin mentioned expenses she'd already mentally assigned herself. An uncle laughed and said, "We'll figure it out. It's family." That was when someone said it. "Well, Linnea won't need much. She's always been low maintenance." It wasn't said with malice. There was no edge to it. In fact, the tone was almost fond, like a compliment that carried an invisible asterisk. A few people nodded. Someone else smiled in my direction, as if checking that I was still agreeable. No one asked me. No one paused to confirm. The conversation moved on. That was the cut. Small, clean, almost surgical. I remember the physical sensation more than the thought. A brief tightening in my chest, a moment where my breath didn't quite sync with the room. I considered correcting it, just a sentence. Actually, I haven't thought about that yet. Something neutral, reasonable. But I didn't say anything. Part of me didn't want to disrupt the flow. Another part told me it wasn't worth it. They're just talking out loud, I thought. Nothing's decided. Still, something had shifted. For the rest of the meeting, I watched how easily that assumption slid into place. Decisions bent around it. Numbers were rounded in ways that subtly excluded me. When someone said, "We'll split the rest evenly," the rest was already defined without my input. No one looked uncomfortable, no one questioned it, and that's what stayed with me, the ease. Later, when we were clearing the table, my aunt touched my arm and said, "You're okay with all this, right? You're always so understanding." It was framed as a check-in, but it wasn't. It was a confirmation. I nodded. That nod echoed longer than it should have. On the drive home, I replayed the moment, trying to minimize it. It's not a big deal. They didn't mean anything by it. You don't even know what you want yet. All true, and all beside the point, because the cut wasn't about the money. It was about the assumption that my wants were smaller, quieter, less valid, without ever being named or explored. It was about being defined in absentia while sitting in the room. Over the next few days, I noticed how often that language appeared. Low maintenance, flexible, easy. Each word sounded positive in isolation. Together they formed a justification. If I were easy, then accommodating me wouldn't be urgent. If I were flexible, then my absence from decisions was an exclusion. It was efficiency. If I didn't ask, then I clearly didn't care. No one said these things outright. They didn't have to. The narrative had already been agreed upon, silently, and I let it stand. Not because I agreed with it, but because I wanted to see how far it would go. That's the part people misunderstand later. They assume silence means ignorance, or fear, or passivity. Sometimes silence is simply data collection. That first small cut taught me something important. Once people believe a story about you, they will build systems around it, and those systems don't require cruelty to function, only convenience. At that point, the damage was minor, reversible even. A conversation could have corrected it. A single sentence might have rebalanced the room. But I didn't intervene. I went home, opened my notebook, and wrote one line. They've already decided who I am. I didn't know yet what that would cost them. Or me. After the first cut, nothing outwardly changed. That was the most unsettling part. There was no fallout, no tension, no whispered apologies. Life continued exactly as it had before, only now the assumptions had a foothold. And once something goes unchallenged, it starts to repeat. Small decisions were made without me and reported later as updates. We thought this made sense. It was easier this way. Always framed as efficiency, never exclusion. I was informed, not consulted. Included, but never centered. At first, I told myself it was temporary, that once things became more concrete, I'd naturally be looped in. Families have rhythms, I reasoned. I didn't want to be the person who made things complicated. So I stayed quiet. Each time it became a little easier, for them. I noticed how conversations shifted when I entered the room. Not abruptly, just subtly. Topics that involved numbers or timelines would wrap themselves up. Someone would summarize instead of continuing. I was spared the details, as if they were doing me a favor. "You don't need to worry about this," one cousin said once, smiling. "We've got it covered." I smiled back. What I didn't say was that I already knew what this was. I knew because I had listened. Because I remembered what people forgot. Because when you're not considered a stakeholder, you're allowed to observe without performing. The language they used around me softened, even as the decisions hardened. I was thanked often, praised for being so chill. Compliments became currency, small offerings meant to compensate for diminishing agency. And I accepted them because at the time I didn't yet see the pattern as disrespect. I saw it as a misunderstanding, something that would correct itself if I remained patient and reasonable. That was my mistake. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as familiarity, as comfort, as the belief that you'll be fine with whatever is decided because you always have been. There was a moment, a small one, that crystallized it for me. We were on a group call discussing next steps. Someone proposed reallocating a portion of the funds to cover an unexpected expense. Another person agreed immediately. A third joked about how it was basically free money anyway. I opened my mouth to speak. Before I could, someone said, "Linnea's good either way." Not a question, a conclusion. I closed my mouth. The call moved on. Afterward, I sat alone in my apartment, the quiet loud in my ears. I realized that my silence was no longer neutral. It was being used as evidence, proof that I didn't need to be considered because I had never insisted on being. And yet I still rationalized staying quiet. If I speak now, it'll seem reactive. They'll say I should have said something earlier. I don't want to look greedy. That last one carried the most weight. Women like me are often praised for not wanting too much, for being grateful, for taking less so others can take more. I had internalized that script so deeply that challenging it felt like a moral failure, not a practical one. So I adjusted internally instead. I stopped expecting fairness. I started expecting patterns, and patterns emerged quickly. The same two voices dominated every discussion. The same people benefited from every temporary decision. The same assumptions about my needs were repeated until they felt factual. No one asked how I felt, they assumed they knew. What they didn't notice was that my emotional response had changed. I wasn't hurt anymore. Hurt requires expectation. What I felt instead was distance, a quiet recalibration. I began documenting, not formally, not yet, just notes, dates, who said what, how decisions were framed, where responsibility landed when things went wrong, and where credit went when things went right. Not because I was planning a confrontation, but because I was done being confused. There's a strange relief that comes when you stop asking why and start accepting that. Once I accepted that my role was being minimized by default, the emotional fog lifted. I could see the structure clearly, and structures can be understood. At this stage, no one was doing anything illegal. No one was shouting or threatening. Everything was polite, reasonable, plausibly fair. That's what made it dangerous. Because when disrespect is normalized, it stops feeling like a problem and starts feeling like reality. And reality, once accepted, is very hard to challenge. By the end of that period, I had become exactly who they thought I was. Agreeable, quiet, uninvolved. What they didn't realize was that this version of me was temporary. Not because I was angry, but because I was learning. Roles in families don't require consent. They're assigned gradually, reinforced casually, and defended collectively. By the time you notice you've been cast, everyone else is already rehearsed. Mine was clear. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed friction so others could move faster. When something needed to be done without debate, it drifted toward me. When something needed to be decided without my involvement, it happened around me. Reliable, useful, invisible. Once I recognized the role, I started seeing how carefully it was protected. If I asked a neutral question, someone would answer for me. If I expressed mild hesitation, it was reframed as stress or fatigue. "You've been working a lot," they'd say, as if my perspective were a symptom to be managed. I wasn't being dismissed loudly, I was being managed gently. And I played along because confrontation would have required emotional energy I wasn't ready to spend. Instead, I watched how the system corrected any deviation. If I pushed too close to decision-making, someone else stepped in. If I pulled back, the machine hummed smoothly. It didn't need me to agree, it just needed me not to resist. There was one afternoon when it became painfully obvious. We were reviewing a draft plan, budgets, contingencies, allocations. I had spent hours looking over the numbers beforehand, out of habit more than obligation. I noticed an inconsistency, not huge but significant enough to matter later. I pointed it out calmly, no accusation, just an observation. The response was immediate and almost coordinated. "Oh, that's already been discussed. It'll balance out. You're probably overthinking it." Someone laughed, lightly, as if to release the tension I hadn't created. The issue was moved past without resolution. No one asked me to explain further. No one revisited the numbers. The message was clear. My analysis was unnecessary. My diligence was optional. My concern was inconvenient. And yet, when something went wrong weeks later, an overlooked fee, a delayed transfer, it landed in my lap. Could I take a look? Could I help sort it out? I did. That's how roles sustain themselves. You're sidelined when it comes to authority and summoned when it comes to repair. Over time, people stop noticing the imbalance. They just feel entitled to your competence. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger would have implied surprise. What I felt was a growing sense of clarity. I began to see that the role wasn't about who I was. It was about what made others comfortable. My calm made their choices feel safer. My silence made their assumptions feel validated. My reliability made their shortcuts feel justified. So I leaned into it, not in a self-sacrificing way, in a strategic one. I stopped offering opinions unless asked. I documented every task I completed, every fix I made, every moment I was excluded from planning but included in execution. I asked neutral follow-up questions via email instead of calls. I saved responses. I noticed who avoided written confirmation and who didn't. All of this happened quietly, without announcement. To them, nothing had changed. To me, everything had. I realized that the role I'd been assigned came with access. People shared things around me they wouldn't have if they felt threatened. They assumed I wasn't paying attention to power, only to process. That assumption was their blind spot. There's a difference between being invisible and being overlooked. Invisibility implies absence. I was present, observing, integrated into the system in ways that gave me a full view of its weaknesses. At some point, someone said, "We're lucky Linnea is so easy to work with." I nodded politely. What I didn't say was that ease is often mistaken for weakness, and weakness is rarely examined. By the end of that phase, my role was cemented. No one questioned it anymore. They didn't need to. It worked for them. And that was the moment I understood something crucial. As long as I remained in this role, I would continue to lose ground. Not through malice, but through momentum. The system would keep moving in a direction that benefited those who spoke loudest, fastest, and first. The question was no longer whether the role was fair. It was whether I would continue to perform it. The shift didn't happen in a room full of people. There was no argument, no raised voice, no moment anyone else could point to later and say, "That's when things changed." It happened on an ordinary afternoon, alone, with paperwork spread across my kitchen table. I was reviewing a set of documents I'd been sent for reference. That phrase had become common. It meant, "Look, but don't touch." I almost didn't open them. Almost told myself I could skim later. Instead, I read carefully. That's when I noticed it, not a single glaring issue, but a pattern of small ones. Adjustments that favored the same individuals, clauses that shifted responsibility quietly, language that sounded collaborative while locking in outcomes. None of it was illegal, none of it was accidental, and none of it had included my consent. I sat back and felt something unfamiliar settle in. Not anger, not sadness, but certainty. For months, I had been reacting emotionally, confusion, disappointment, self-doubt. In that moment, those feelings drained away. What replaced them was a clean, steady awareness. This isn't going to correct itself. I had believed, somewhere deep down, that fairness was the default, that if I stayed reasonable, the system would eventually notice the imbalance and adjust. But systems don't self-correct. They optimize for those who engage them. And I hadn't been engaging. That realization wasn't loud, it was sobering. I remember closing the folder and just sitting there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the muted sounds of the city outside. No music, no distractions, just the weight of clarity. I asked myself a simple question. If nothing changes, where does this end? The answer was obvious, and it wasn't about money. It was about erasure. About being slowly reduced to a function instead of a voice, about teaching people through my own restraint that my boundaries were theoretical. That was the moment I stopped waiting, not waiting for permission, not waiting for acknowledgement, not waiting for someone else to notice. I didn't decide to confront anyone. I didn't decide to stand up for myself in the way people usually mean it. There was no speech rehearsed in my head. What I decided was simpler and more consequential. I decided to become intentional. Up until then, my silence had been reactive, a way to avoid discomfort. From that point on, it became deliberate. I opened my notebook and started fresh, not with emotions, with facts. dates, amounts, who proposed what, who benefited, who approved, who avoided putting things in writing. I cross-referenced documents. I reread messages I'd previously skimmed. I paid attention to timelines. I noticed inconsistencies that had seemed insignificant before. And as I did, a larger picture emerged. The system wasn't chaotic. It was efficient for a specific few. Decisions flowed through informal channels, then solidified quickly. Dissent was minimized by speed and consensus theater. By the time something reached me, it was already framed as done. Understanding that changed how I felt about my past silence. It wasn't weakness, it was an unstructured observation. Now it had structure. That day, I didn't call anyone. I didn't send any emails. I didn't signal that anything had changed. I went for a walk instead. The city felt different. Not because it had changed, but because I had. The noise didn't bother me. The pace didn't rush me. I felt oddly grounded, like I'd finally stepped onto solid ground after months of moving through fog. I wasn't angry at my relatives. I wasn't plotting against them. I wasn't interested in punishing anyone. I was interested in not being erased. That distinction mattered, because from that moment on, every choice I made would be guided by alignment, not reaction. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't trying to reclaim a role. I was preparing to step out of it. And once you see clearly, you can't unsee. The shift wasn't visible yet. No one else felt it. But internally, a line had been crossed. Silence was no longer something that happened to me. It was something I was choosing. After that day, nothing about my behavior looked different on the surface. I still answered messages promptly. I still showed up when expected. I still listened more than I spoke. But internally, the function of my silence had changed. Before, silence had been a cushion, something soft I used to absorb tension. Now it was a tool, deliberate, focused, measured. I stopped filling gaps in conversations. When someone paused, expecting me to smooth things over, I let the silence sit. When assumptions were made about my agreement, I neither confirmed nor denied them. I simply acknowledged the information and moved on. It was subtle enough that no one commented on it, but the dynamic shifted just enough to reveal something interesting. People began to talk more. When you stop reassuring others, they compensate by explaining themselves, justifying, oversharing, especially when they believe you're still on their side. I listened. I noticed who felt the need to narrate their reasoning unprompted, who grew uneasy without my nod of approval, who spoke faster when I stayed neutral. Silence, I learned, is unsettling to people who rely on consensus more than clarity. At the same time, I became more precise. If I asked a question, it was specific. If I responded, it was factual. I stopped volunteering solutions unless explicitly requested. I stopped rescuing conversations from discomfort. And when I was asked for help, I asked for context. Politely, calmly, in writing. Can you send me the full breakdown? Which version are we working from? Who's approved this so far? Each question was reasonable, necessary even. And each one slowed the process just enough to expose how much had been operating on assumption. No one accused me of anything. No one confronted me. But I could feel the shift in tone. You're being very thorough, someone said once, half joking. I smiled, just trying to stay aligned. That word, aligned, did a lot of work. What they didn't realize was that my alignment had changed, not against them, toward myself. Silence gave me space to think strategically instead of emotionally. I stopped asking whether something felt fair and started asking whether it was documented, whether it was consistent, whether it was defensible. I wasn't planning a reveal. I wasn't building a case. I was simply ensuring that if my name was attached to something, it was attached correctly. And slowly, people adjusted around me. They began to exclude me less from certain threads, not because they valued my input more, but because my presence required more precision, more clarity, more accountability. That was telling. Others, however, continued exactly as before. They assumed my questions were procedural, not purposeful, that my silence still meant consent. They mistook restraint for stagnation. One evening, I realized something important. No one had asked me how I felt in months. not genuinely, not without an agenda, and I was okay with that. Because emotions clouded the early part of this story. They made me second guess myself. They kept me hoping for acknowledgement that wasn't coming. Now, I didn't need validation, I needed accuracy. Silence helped me separate the two. I became aware of how often people rely on emotional cues to gauge resistance. When there's no visible reaction, they assume safety. They assume permission. What they forget is that permission can be revoked quietly. From the outside, it still looked like I was easy, compliant, unbothered. Inside, I was clear. Clear about what I would no longer fix. Clear about what I would no longer absorb. Clear about the fact that my calm was no longer for their comfort. And clarity changes posture even when it doesn't change volume. I slept better during that time, not because the situation had resolved, but because I was no longer betraying myself by pretending I didn't see what was happening. Silence, when chosen, is stabilizing. It creates room to move without announcing direction. And while no one else noticed it yet, that room was where everything that followed would begin. What they never noticed was how much access comes with being underestimated. When people don't see you as a variable, they stop accounting for you. They speak freely in your presence. They forward emails without double-checking recipients. They see you for visibility, assuming visibility is harmless when you're not perceived as a decision maker. That assumption gave me a full map. I saw how conversations began privately and were later presented publicly as group decisions. I saw how numbers shifted between drafts, never dramatically, always just enough to favor the same outcomes. I saw how accountability was distributed unevenly, softened for some, hardened for others. And because I wasn't seen as a threat, no one thought to obscure it. Preparation didn't look like plotting, it looked like consistency. Every document I received, I archived. Every version was labeled by date. I noted changes that weren't highlighted. I tracked approvals, who gave them, and when. I saved messages that summarized decisions without evidence of discussion. Not to accuse, to understand. I learned the rhythm of how things moved. Informal agreement first, documentation later. Consensus implied, not confirmed. By the time something was written down, it was framed as settled. That's how momentum replaces consent. I also noticed something else, how often people contradicted themselves without realizing it. A number justified one way in April was justified differently in June. A temporary arrangement quietly became permanent. A promise made casually was forgotten conveniently. I didn't correct them. I let the contradictions exist. There's a strange power in letting people finish their own sentences, even when those sentences don't align with reality. Especially then. I began cross-referencing not just documents, but narratives. Who told which version of events, and to whom? Who emphasized urgency? Who emphasized fairness? Who emphasized family when it suited them, and process when it didn't? Patterns sharpened. One relative consistently pushed for speed. Another consistently avoided written confirmation. A third positioned themselves as mediator while quietly endorsing outcomes that benefited them most. None of this required interpretation. It was observable. What surprised me most was how little effort it took once I stopped being emotionally involved. Without the need to defend myself or be understood, my attention freed up. I could see clearly because I wasn't hoping for a different outcome anymore. I also began educating myself quietly. I reviewed basic financial distribution principles, read about fiduciary responsibility, learned what documentation typically exists in situations like ours, and what its absence implies. I didn't announce this learning. I didn't hint at it. To them, I was still the same Linnea, helpful, calm, peripheral. They didn't notice when I stopped answering certain questions immediately. They didn't notice when I asked for clarification instead of offering solutions. They didn't notice when I declined to just handle it without context. What they did notice, faintly, was friction. Processes took longer. Conversations required more specificity. Decisions couldn't glide forward on assumptions alone. They attributed it to complexity, to stress, to timing. Not to me. And that was the most important part. Because preparation only works when it doesn't trigger defense. The moment people feel threatened, they change their behavior. They close ranks. They rewrite records. No one felt threatened by me. They felt comfortable. I remember one comment in particular. "You're so steady," someone said. "You never get caught up in the drama." I smiled. What they didn't understand was that stepping out of drama doesn't mean stepping out of reality. It means observing it without distortion. By the end of that phase, I knew exactly where every major decision point was. I knew which actions were reversible and which weren't. I knew who would panic under scrutiny and who would retreat. I also knew something else, something quieter but more important. I knew I didn't need to expose anyone. The system was already unstable. It relied on speed, trust, and the assumption that no one was paying attention. It wasn't built to withstand stillness, or documentation, or time. All I had to do was stop compensating for its weaknesses and let gravity do the rest. They never noticed the preparation because it didn't look like resistance. It looked like professionalism, like diligence, like someone staying in her lane. That's the danger of underestimation. You assume the person you're overlooking isn't learning, when in reality, they're learning everything. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as confirmation. By then, I wasn't looking for something dramatic. I wasn't hunting for betrayal or proof of bad intent. I was simply following threads to their natural conclusions. And one afternoon, those threads converged. I was reviewing a chain of documents, nothing unusual on the surface, just revisions, attachments, and forwarded summaries. The kind of administrative noise that usually blends together if you're not paying attention. But I was paying attention. I noticed a discrepancy between two versions of the same allocation plan. Not the totals always matched. It was the timing. One version referenced approvals that, according to the timeline, hadn't happened yet. Another quietly reassigned responsibility in a footnote that wasn't present in earlier drafts. Individually, they were explainable. Together, they told a story. I laid everything out on my table, printed pages, notes, dates. I traced the evolution of a single decision across weeks. Who initiated it? Who endorsed it? Who benefited from the final version? And there it was. A structural imbalance that wasn't accidental and wasn't temporary. A setup that protected certain people from risk while distributing obligation elsewhere, subtly, cleanly, without ever stating it outright, including me. My name appeared where accountability was needed, not where authority had been granted. That was the reveal. Not that someone had lied, but that the system had been designed to function without my consent, while still using my credibility as support. I didn't feel outraged. I felt calm, because clarity, once earned, is grounding. I sat there for a long time, not thinking about what to do next, but about what I now knew. Knowledge has weight. Once you carry it, pretending you don't becomes a choice, and a costly one. I checked myself carefully in that moment, not for fear, but for motive. Was I tempted to confront someone immediately? No. Did I feel the urge to expose everything? Also no. What I felt was restraint, because I understood something important. Information doesn't create power unless it's used at the right time, in the right way, for the right purpose. And my purpose wasn't to win an argument. It was to stop participating in a structure that depended on my silence. I reviewed the documents again, this time with a different lens. Not what's wrong, but what's defensible. What could be questioned calmly? What is the required explanation? What assumptions would collapse under neutral scrutiny? I also noticed what was missing. Certain approvals weren't documented. Certain decisions had no clear origin. Certain responsibilities had been reassigned without explicit acknowledgement. None of this meant wrongdoing in the criminal sense, but it meant exposure, and exposure changes behavior. I closed the folder and wrote one sentence in my notebook. I no longer owe this system my invisibility. That was the moment the story became irreversible, not because I acted, but because I couldn't unknow what I knew. Still, I didn't tell anyone. Not because I was afraid, but because there was no benefit in alerting people before I was ready to move. I did it differently. I wasn't trying to trap anyone. I was trying to realign my own position. The reveal didn't make me feel superior, it made me feel responsible. Responsible for how I would proceed, for staying within my moral code, for choosing actions that were proportionate, legal, and grounded. I didn't want chaos, I wanted clarity. And clarity requires patience. From that point on, every interaction was filtered through that understanding. When someone summarized a decision vaguely, I noted it. When someone avoided specifics, I waited. When someone relied on my assumed agreement, I withheld it. Politely, quietly. Nothing exploded. But the ground had shifted. The reveal wasn't something I announced. It was something I integrated. And once integrated, it changed how I stood in the room, even when I didn't say a word. They still thought I was watching passively. They were wrong. I was watching accurately. Once you see the full shape of something, you reach a quiet fork in the road. Before the reveal, I had believed naively that staying observant was enough, that clarity alone would protect me. But clarity by itself doesn't change outcomes. It only sharpens responsibility. I stood at that decision point longer than I expected. There were several options, all of them reasonable on the surface. I could speak up immediately, ask for a meeting, present what I'd noticed as concerns, frame gently, collaboratively. That approach would likely result in reassurances, partial adjustments, and subtle resistance. The system would adapt just enough to survive, and my role would remain unchanged. Except now, I'd be labeled difficult. I could withdraw, stop engaging beyond the minimum, let the structure continue without my support, and hope it collapses under its own weight. But withdrawal has consequences too. Silence without intention looks like abandonment, not integrity. And it would still leave my name attached to decisions I hadn't truly consented to. Or I could do something quieter and more final. I could reposition myself. That option didn't involve confrontation or exposure. It involved changing the conditions under which I participated, removing assumptions, requiring clarity, creating boundaries that couldn't be bypassed by speed or familiarity. That choice felt irreversible, not because it would cause harm, but because it would change how people related to me permanently. Once you stop being useful in the way people expect, they don't know where to place you. I took my time deciding, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to be certain my actions aligned with my values. I wasn't interested in teaching anyone a lesson. I wasn't interested in reclaiming lost ground through force. I was interested in consent. So I asked myself one final question. What would I do if I were no longer trying to preserve anyone else's comfort? The answer was immediate. I would formalize everything. No more implied agreement, no more verbal summaries, no more decisions floating past me with my name quietly attached. I would move from participant to position holder. That decision didn't require anyone else's approval. It only required consistency. I began with small, deliberate shifts. When asked to handle something, I asked for scope and authority in writing. When included in discussions, I clarified my role before offering input. When decisions were summarized without documentation, I requested confirmation, not as a challenge, but as a requirement. Each action was reasonable, professional, calm, and each one narrowed the system's ability to operate on assumption. This wasn't about setting traps, it was about removing ambiguity. And ambiguity had been the system's greatest asset. The more precise I became, the more pressure built, not on me, but around me. Conversations slowed. People hesitated before looping me in. Some tried to reassert the old dynamic with reassurance and praise. You don't need to worry so much. We trust you. This is just how we've been doing it. I listened. I acknowledged. I didn't comply. Trust without clarity is a liability. And I was done absorbing liability on behalf of others. What made the decision irreversible was that I no longer cared how it looked. I wasn't trying to maintain an image of being easy. I wasn't trying to avoid discomfort. I was trying to be accurate. Accuracy, I learned, is deeply unsettling to people who rely on informality for advantage. Still, I didn't announce a change. I didn't declare boundaries. I simply acted as if they already existed. And because boundaries weren't spoken, they couldn't be negotiated away. At that point, I knew something else with certainty. Once this process began, it would reveal everyone's priorities. Some would adapt, some would resist, some would make mistakes out of impatience. I didn't need to predict which was which. All I needed was to stay still and let the structure respond. That was the decision. Not to confront, not to withdraw, but to move forward in a way that made my consent visible and my absence from it impossible to ignore. And once that choice was made, there was no going back to being invisible. From the outside, it looked like nothing was happening. That was intentional. I didn't change my tone. I didn't withdraw emotionally. I didn't hint at dissatisfaction. I simply changed the mechanics of my participation. I moved in silence, not secrecy, but restraint. Every action I took was visible, reasonable, and defensible. The power came from what I didn't explain. I stopped filling in gaps. I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been articulated. I stopped translating vague intentions into functional outcomes. When someone asked me to take care of something, I asked what authority I had to do so. When someone summarized a decision verbally, I asked for it in writing. When timelines shifted, I requested updated confirmation. None of this was aggressive. It was procedural. And procedures, once enforced, don't require emotion. The first few times, people complied easily. They assumed it was temporary, a phase perhaps. Stress, overwhelm. They adapted just enough to move forward. But over time, the friction accumulated. Decisions that once moved quickly now stalled. People had to slow down and clarify. Approvals had to be explicit. Responsibility had to be assigned intentionally. And in that slowing, the cracks began to show. Some people became impatient. Others became evasive. A few tried to reroute around me, looping in others, reframing decisions to avoid scrutiny. That told me everything I needed to know. I didn't block those attempts. I noted them. I also began disengaging selectively. Not withdrawing completely, just removing myself from areas where my involvement was assumed but not respected. If I weren't given authority, I wouldn't provide labor. If my input wasn't requested, I didn't offer it. Again, this was done quietly. I didn't announce that I was stepping back. I simply stopped compensating. The effect was subtle but immediate. Small errors went unfixed. Miscommunications multiplied. Tasks that had once just worked now required effort. And still, no one confronted me. Because confronting me would have required acknowledging that I had been carrying more than my share, and that acknowledgement would unravel the narrative. Instead, people adjusted in less direct ways. One relative became unusually attentive, another began documenting more carefully. A third grew defensive, framing my questions as unnecessary bureaucracy. I responded to all of them the same way, calmly, consistently, without explanation. I just want to make sure we're aligned. Happy to help once the scope is clear. Let me know when that's confirmed. Those phrases became my anchor. They were impossible to argue with without revealing intent. Behind the scenes, I also took steps to protect myself. I reviewed my name's placement on documents. I requested clarifications where accountability was implied but authority was absent. I ensured that anything I was responsible for was something I had actually agreed to. Again, nothing dramatic, just alignment. The most interesting part was how little attention this drew at first. People are remarkably slow to notice quiet shifts, especially when they benefit from the status quo. By the time they sensed something was different, they couldn't pinpoint when it had started. There was no moment to challenge, no statement to quote back at me. There was only the present reality, processes that no longer bent automatically around them. And that reality was uncomfortable. I remember one call in particular. Someone was clearly frustrated, trying to push a decision through quickly. They summarized, paused, and waited for my usual nod. I said nothing. The silence stretched. Finally, they asked, "Are you okay with this?" It was the first time anyone had asked me that directly in months. I took a breath. "I don't have enough information to say either way yet," I replied. "Once I do, I'll let you know." There was no argument, no outburst. Just a quiet recalibration. That's how moving in silence works. You don't force change. You create conditions where the old way can't continue without revealing itself. By the end of that period, the system was under strain, not because I attacked it, but because I stopped holding it together. And when support is removed from something unbalanced, it doesn't collapse all at once. It starts to lean. The first consequences didn't arrive with noise, they arrived in confusion. People began to feel a loss before they understood its source. Things took longer. Questions went unanswered, not because I ignored them, but because I waited for clarity that never came. Responsibilities slipped between hands that weren't used to holding them. At first, it was framed as an inconvenience. This is getting complicated. We're overthinking things. Why does everything suddenly need to be so formal? No one said my name in those complaints. They didn't need to. The discomfort hovered around me like a weather change no one wanted to acknowledge. I watched carefully, not with satisfaction, but with focus. This was the part I had anticipated but couldn't control. Once assumptions are removed, people are forced to confront gaps they didn't know existed. And when those gaps affect outcomes, the instinct is to look for something or someone to blame. Still, no one blamed me directly. Instead, they turned on each other. One relative accused another of not communicating clearly. Someone else pushed back, pointing out that they'd never approved the change in question. Old conversations were reinterpreted. Offhand comments were reframed as commitments. And suddenly the tone shifted. What had once been collaborative became defensive. What had once been casual became precise, but too late. I stayed quiet, not disengaged, just steady. When asked for input, I gave it factually. When asked to resolve something, I requested documentation. When tensions rose, I didn't soothe them. I had learned that soothing only delays reckoning. The most telling moment came when someone said, "This never used to be a problem." They were right. It hadn't been a problem when I was absorbing the uncertainty, when I was filling in gaps without being asked, when I was quietly aligning everyone else at my own expense. The problem wasn't complexity. The problem was accountability. As the pressure built, alliances shifted. People who had once spoken with confidence grew cautious. Those who had benefited most from informality became the loudest advocates for keeping things simple. But simplicity, I now knew, was code for unchecked. Meetings grew tense. Emails became longer, more carefully worded. Some people started copying others preemptively, building their own paper trails. That was the moment I understood the full scope of what was happening. My relatives turned on each other over $180,000. Not because I forced it, not because I revealed anything, but because the system that had protected them from scrutiny no longer held. Without a quiet buffer to absorb ambiguity, every decision became visible. Every shortcut became traceable. Every unspoken agreement demanded interpretation. And interpretation breeds conflict. I watched dynamics shift in real time. People who had once spoken over others now hesitated. Those who had leaned on my reliability now felt exposed by its absence. A few tried to pull me back into the old role. "You're so good at keeping things calm. Can you just help smooth this out? We don't need to make this bigger than it is." I listened, I nodded, and I didn't step in. Because stepping in would have meant resuming responsibility without authority. It would have meant undoing months of intentional alignment. So I stayed where I was, present, calm, observant. As tensions escalated, something else happened, something quieter, but more revealing. People began revisiting old conversations, trying to remember who had said what, and in those moments, my earlier silence became a liability for them. Because I remembered. Not emotionally, accurately. I had notes, dates, versions, not to weaponize, but to understand. And when I was asked to clarify something, I did, gently, precisely. "No, that wasn't agreed to in that meeting." That version came later. My understanding was different. Each clarification landed like a small weight. No accusations, no raised voices, just facts. That's when the realization began to spread. Not loudly, not all at once, but unmistakably. The ground had shifted, and the person they had assumed would quietly hold everything together was no longer doing that. The consequences weren't dramatic yet. No one was panicking, no one was apologizing. But the ease was gone. And once ease disappears from a system built on assumption, what remains is exposure. The moment people realized something was wrong, they assumed it could still be repaired. That assumption lingered longer than it should have. At first, the attempts were subtle. Reassuring messages, casual check-ins framed as concern, a return to warmer language, as if familiarity alone could rewind the process. Let's all just get back on the same page. We're family. This shouldn't be so hard. I think we've just misunderstood each other. I listened to all of it without reacting. Because misunderstandings can be clarified. What was happening now could not. The system had already begun to collapse under its own weight, not dramatically, but decisively. Decisions were being questioned retroactively. People were disagreeing about what had been agreed to. Responsibility was being passed sideways, carefully, as if no one wanted to be the one holding it when things settled. And the most telling sign was urgency. Suddenly, everyone wanted a resolution, quickly, cleanly, without revisiting the past too closely. That's how you know it's too late. When people push for speed after avoiding clarity, it's not efficiency they want, it's escape. Someone suggested bringing in an outside perspective. Another proposed simplifying the entire arrangement. A third tried to summarize everything into a single document, glossing over the inconsistencies. I was included in these conversations now, actively, directly. The irony wasn't lost on me. For the first time in months, people were asking what I thought, what I recommended, whether I agreed, not because they valued my insight, but because they needed my stability back. They wanted the version of me that smoothed things over, the one who translated confusion into order without asking uncomfortable questions. That version was gone. When asked for my opinion, I didn't refuse. I responded carefully. I think we need to slow down. I'm not comfortable confirming that without documentation. I'd need clarity on how this responsibility is being assigned. Each response was reasonable. Each one was met with visible frustration. This is getting out of hand, someone said. We're making this bigger than it needs to be, another replied. But the truth was simpler. They weren't upset about complexity, they were upset about the loss of control. The more they tried to fix things quickly, the more obvious the cracks became. Old assurances no longer hold, informal agreements didn't align. People remembered events differently, and there was no neutral ground left to settle those differences. That's when panic began to surface. Not openly, not yet, but in tone. Voices sharpened, messages became curt. People started positioning themselves, emphasizing what they hadn't approved, what they had questioned. And in the middle of it all, I remained still, not detached, not smug, just grounded. Because I had already accepted the outcome they were still trying to avoid. This would not return to how it was. Once accountability becomes visible, it can't be unseen. Once people realize their assumptions no longer protect them, trust erodes quickly. A few tried to appeal to emotion. You know, none of this was intentional. We didn't mean to exclude you. Can't we just move forward? I believed them. Intent wasn't the issue. Impact was, and moving forward without addressing structure would have meant reinstating the same conditions that created the problem. That was the moment I understood something quietly definitive. Even if I wanted to fix it, I couldn't, not without sacrificing myself again. The system didn't need repair, it needed replacement, and replacements are disruptive by nature. As discussions stalled, the pressure shifted outward. People began to scrutinize each other more closely. Frustration that had nowhere to land turned sideways. What had once been polite disagreement became a thinly veiled accusation, not explosive, but corrosive. And through it all, I was no longer invisible. I was present as a boundary, not a person they could lean on, a limit they had reached too late. By the time someone finally said, "We should have handled this differently," it wasn't an invitation to collaborate. It was an admission, and admissions don't undo damage. They only acknowledge it. At that point, everyone was reacting. I wasn't, because I had already moved past the stage where reaction mattered. The realization that it was too late didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy, because once a system collapses, no one walks away untouched. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was quieter than anyone expected. There was no dramatic meeting called, no raised voices, no list of grievances was laid out on the table. It unfolded in fragments, short conversations, careful questions, moments where silence said more than words. The first time someone addressed it directly, it was almost hesitant. "I feel like you've been distant lately," they said. Not accusing, searching. I considered my response carefully. "I've been precise," I replied. That single word changed the tone. Precision is hard to argue with. It doesn't imply hostility. It doesn't invite debate. It simply states a standard. Another conversation followed days later, more direct this time. "Do you think we treated you unfairly?" I didn't answer immediately, not to punish the question, but to honor it. "I think a lot of decisions were made without my consent," I said finally, and I adjusted accordingly. There was a pause. No denial, no justification, just discomfort. What struck me was how quickly people wanted reassurance afterward. As if naming the issue created a vacuum they expected me to fill with forgiveness, with warmth, with resolution. I didn't. Not because I was withholding, but because reassurance would have implied that things could return to normal. They couldn't. When someone tried to explain their intentions, I listened. When they expressed regret, I acknowledged it, but I didn't soften my position. "I'm not upset," I said more than once. "I'm just not willing to participate the way I used to." That distinction mattered. Anger invites defense. Calm invites reflection. Without emotional heat, there was nothing for them to push against. No outburst to frame as an overreaction, no bitterness to dismiss, just a boundary. One relative asked, almost plaintively, "So what do you want now?" It was the wrong question. "What I want isn't the issue," I replied gently. "What I consent to is." That was the moment I saw understanding flicker. No agreement, not relief, understanding. They realized finally that I wasn't negotiating for a better position within the old structure. I was declining the structure entirely. The conversation ended without resolution. And that was enough, because resolution had never been the goal. Clarity had. After that, interactions changed. People were more careful, more distant, less assumptive. Some avoided me entirely. Others overcorrected, seeking approval where they'd never sought it before. I responded to all of it consistently, calm, clear, unavailable for ambiguity. There was no dramatic fallout, no family rupture, just a subtle reordering of relationships. Some connections thinned, others recalibrated, and I accepted that without grief. Because confrontation without heat doesn't satisfy anyone's need for catharsis, but it does establish truth. The truth was simple. I hadn't changed. I had stopped compensating. And once compensation ends, systems reveal what they actually cost. Who I am now isn't louder than who I was before. I didn't become sharper, colder, or more aggressive. I didn't reinvent myself or adopt a harder edge to prove a point. What changed wasn't my personality, it was my posture. I no longer shrink to maintain ease. There's a difference between being kind and being available for misuse. For a long time, I blurred that line, telling myself that generosity was harmless, that patience was a virtue, that staying quiet kept the peace. What I understand now is that peace built on self-erasure isn't peace at all. It's a pause, and pauses always end. Today, I move more slowly, but with intention. I don't rush to fill silences. I don't over-explain. I don't assume responsibility without authority. When I agree to something, it's because I've chosen it, not because it drifted toward me. People notice. Some interpret it as distance, others have confidence. A few mistake it for detachment. I let them. I don't need to be understood by everyone to be aligned with myself. My relationships are quieter now. Cleaner, fewer assumptions. When I'm included, it's deliberate. When I'm not, it's clear. There's relief in that clarity, even when it costs closeness. Especially then. I still care about my family. That didn't change. What changed is how I express that care. I no longer translate chaos into comfort at my own expense. I no longer mediate conflicts I didn't create. I no longer absorb tension so others can remain unaware of it. That doesn't make me unkind. It makes me honest. I've also learned something about power that no one teaches you directly. Power isn't volume. It isn't control. It's the ability to choose how and whether you participate. Quiet dominance doesn't announce itself. It shows up as consistency, as boundaries that don't require enforcement because they're not performative, as a presence that doesn't need to prove anything. That's who I am now. Someone who watches carefully, not to protect myself from the world, but to engage with it accurately. Someone who understands that silence can be a shield or a weapon depending on how it's used. And I use it with care. The story didn't end with apologies or reconciliation arcs. It ended with a redefinition, with me stepping out of a role that never fit and into one I built consciously. I don't regret staying quiet for as long as I did. It taught me how people behave when they think no one is paying attention. And I don't regret speaking when I finally did, because I didn't raise my voice. I raised my standards. That's the part no one expects. You don't have to become someone else to reclaim yourself. You just have to stop disappearing. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a winner. People want a lesson with sharp edges, a moment where someone is exposed, humbled, put in their place. But that's not what happened here, and it's not what stayed with me. What stayed with me was quieter. I learned that most harm isn't done by cruelty. It's done by comfort. By people settling into patterns that benefit them and never questioning who pays the price for that ease. I learned how easily good intentions can coexist with unfair outcomes, and how rarely intention matters when impact is ignored. I also learned something about silence. Silence isn't weakness. It's not virtue either. It's a state, and like any state, it can be entered unconsciously or by choice. When it's unconscious, it erodes you. When it's chosen, it can become a form of integrity. For a long time, I stayed quiet because I believed that was the kindest thing to do. What I didn't realize was that kindness without consent turns into self-betrayal, and self-betrayal, repeated enough times, teaches people exactly how far they can go. That's the part we don't like to admit. Boundaries don't begin when someone crosses a line. They begin when you stop pretending the line isn't there. My relatives didn't wake up one day and decide to exclude me. They followed the path of least resistance. And I had made myself that path by being capable, calm, and silent in ways that made exclusion easy to justify. Watching them turn on each other over $180,000 wasn't satisfying. It was clarifying. It showed me what happens when accountability is delayed, when assumptions replace communication, and when one person quietly carries the weight, allowing others to forget that weight exists at all. The moral isn't to trust your family. It isn't money that reveals who people really are. Those are too simple. The moral is this: if you don't make your consent visible, people will build systems that function without it. And once those systems are in place, undoing them is painful for everyone involved. What I hope you take from this story isn't fear or suspicion or a desire to withdraw. I hope you raise awareness. Awareness of how you're perceived, of what people assume you'll tolerate, of where you might be staying quiet, not out of strength, but out of habit. You don't need to confront everyone who misunderstands you. You don't need to explain yourself endlessly. You don't need to prove your worth by being indispensable. Sometimes the most powerful shift happens when you stop compensating and let reality respond. I'm not telling this story to position myself as right and others as wrong. I'm telling it because many of us have been the quiet ones in the room, the reliable one, the one people lean on without noticing the weight. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear from you. Not about what you think I should have done, but about your own experience. Have you ever realized that people were making decisions about you, without you, and only understood it once you stopped making things easy? I'll be reading the comments.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.